Min-jun walked along Haeundae Beach early in the morning. The sand felt cold under his feet. He liked to take pictures of the sunrise for his photo blog. Nobody else was on the beach this early, which made it perfect. Min-jun climbed over some rocks to reach a hidden cove he had found last week. He thought it would make a great spot for today's photos. As he got closer to the cove, Min-jun heard strange sounds. It was like singing, but not any song he knew. The sounds seemed to come from behind the big rocks ahead. Min-jun moved quietly, not wanting to scare away whatever was making the noise. He held his camera ready. Maybe it was a rare seabird that would make his blog famous. What Min-jun saw next made him drop his camera in the sand. In the small pool between the rocks were two creatures. From the waist up, they looked like people, but where legs should be, they had long, shiny fishtails. One had blue-green scales that sparkled in the morning light. The other had dark red scales that looked almost black in the shadows. They were sea people, a mermaid and a merman, and they were touching each other in a way that made Min-jun's face turn red. Min-jun tried to back away quietly, but his foot hit an empty soda can someone had left on the beach. The sound was small, but the sea creatures heard it. Their heads snapped toward him, eyes wide with shock. Min-jun had never seen such eyes. They were all black with no white parts. The creatures hissed, showing teeth that were sharp like a shark's. Min-jun didn't wait to see more. He grabbed his camera and ran as fast as he could. All the way home, Min-jun kept looking over his shoulder. He felt like someone was watching him. When he finally reached his small apartment, he locked the door and closed all the windows. His hands shook as he looked through the pictures on his camera. Most were just of the beach and sunrise, but the last one showed something. It was blurry, but he could make out the shape of a human-like face peering out of the water, with eyes that seemed to stare right at him through the screen. 3 days passed, and Min-jun tried to forget what he had seen. He told himself it was just people in costumes, playing a joke. Or maybe he had been more tired than he thought that morning. He went to work at the small coffee shop near Busan University as usual. His boss, Mrs. Kim, asked why he looked so tired. Min-jun just smiled and said he was staying up too late watching movies. During his lunch break, Min-jun sat at a table near the window. A girl walked in that he had never seen before. She had long black hair that was wet, like she had just come from swimming. Her skin was very pale, and she wore a long dress that covered her legs completely. She ordered nothing but sat down right across from Min-jun. "You should not have been at that beach," she said, in a voice that sounded like water running over stones. Min-jun felt his heart beat faster. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he already knew. The girl leaned forward. Water dripped from her hair onto the table. "You saw things you should not have seen," she whispered. "They are angry. They feel you have stolen something from them." Min-jun wanted to run, but the coffee shop was full of people. Surely she wouldn't hurt him here. "I didn't steal anything," he said. "I just took pictures of the sunrise." "You stole a moment that was not for human eyes," the girl said. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes flashed with anger. "And now they want something in return." She slid a small shell across the table. It was shaped like a spiral and shimmered with colors Min-jun had never seen before. "Place this in the water at the same spot before the next full moon. It is the only way to make peace." Then she stood up and walked out, leaving small wet footprints on the floor. Mrs. Kim came over after the strange girl left. "Who was your friend?" she asked. "She looked familiar somehow." Min-jun shook his head. "Just someone asking for directions," he lied. He picked up the shell, meaning to throw it away, but it felt warm in his hand, and the colors seemed to move when he looked at it. Min-jun put it in his pocket instead. Later that night, he dreamed of dark water and singing voices calling his name from the depths. Min-jun tried to go back to normal life, but strange things kept happening. His apartment always smelled like sea salt now, no matter how many windows he opened. The water from his shower sometimes came out as salt water, burning his eyes. At night, he heard tapping on his windows, even though he lived on the 5th floor. When he checked his phone's photo album, the beach pictures were gone, replaced with images of dark water. His friend Ji-hoon noticed something was wrong. "You look terrible," he said when they met for lunch at a small restaurant near the harbor. "Are you sick?" Min-jun wanted to tell someone about what was happening, and Ji-hoon was his oldest friend. Maybe he would believe him. "I saw something at the beach last week," Min-jun began. "Something not normal." Ji-hoon leaned in, curious. Min-jun told him everything, from the sea creatures to the strange girl at the coffee shop. Ji-hoon was quiet for a long time after Min-jun finished his story. Min-jun expected his friend to laugh or tell him he was crazy. Instead, Ji-hoon looked serious. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the sea people," he said quietly. "She said they lived in the deep waters off Jeju Island. They rarely showed themselves to humans, but when they did, it meant bad luck." Ji-hoon took out his phone and showed Min-jun a news story from that morning. 3 fishermen disappeared last night. Their boat was found empty. "You think the sea people took them?" Min-jun asked, his voice shaking. Ji-hoon shrugged. "I don't know, but the fisherman's boat was found near the cove you talked about." Min-jun felt cold all over. He took out the shell the strange girl had given him. It seemed to glow brighter now. "She said I need to return this before the full moon. That's tomorrow night." Ji-hoon looked at the shell with wide eyes. "Then you'd better do it," he said. "My grandmother said you should never ignore a gift from the sea people." That night, Min-jun couldn't sleep. The tapping on his windows was louder than ever. When he got up to check, he saw wet handprints sliding down the glass from the outside. On his bathroom mirror, written in what looked like salt, were the words, "Return what you took." Min-jun sat in the corner of his room until morning, the shell clutched tightly in his hand, as strange singing voices seemed to come from the drains of his apartment. The next day, Min-jun called in sick to work. He spent the day pacing his apartment, trying to decide what to do. The shell in his pocket felt heavier with each passing hour. Sometimes he thought he could hear whispers coming from it, speaking in a language he didn't understand, but somehow still felt familiar. By evening, he knew he had to go back to the cove. The full moon would rise soon. Ji-hoon insisted on coming with him. "You shouldn't face this alone," he said, when Min-jun tried to talk him out of it. They reached the beach just as the sun was setting. The tide was coming in, and the waves crashed against the rocks with more force than seemed natural. Min-jun led the way to the hidden cove, his heart pounding in his chest. The place looked different in the fading light, more dangerous somehow. As they reached the edge of the small pool where Min-jun had seen the sea creatures, the water began to bubble. Ji-hoon grabbed Min-jun's arm, pulling him back. "Maybe we should just throw the shell in and run," he whispered. But before Min-jun could answer, 2 heads broke the surface of the water. It was them, the mermaid with her blue-green scales and the merman with his dark red tail. Their black eyes fixed on Min-jun, and they smiled, showing their sharp teeth. "You have brought what we asked for," the mermaid said. Her voice sounded like waves breaking on the shore. She held out her hand, which had thin webs between the fingers. Min-jun stepped forward to give her the shell, but Ji-hoon held him back. "Wait," Ji-hoon said. "What happens after he gives it to you? How do we know you won't hurt him?" The merman laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Smart human," he said, "but we only want what is ours." Min-jun looked at the shell in his hand, then at the sea people waiting in the water. Something felt wrong. The girl at the coffee shop had said the shell was to make peace, but the sea creatures seemed too eager to get it back. Min-jun remembered his grandmother's stories about spirits that tried to trick humans. What if this was a trick? What if the shell was not what they claimed? Min-jun closed his fist around the shell and stepped back. "First," he said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded, "tell me what this really is." The sea creatures' faces changed. Their smiles disappeared, replaced by looks of fury. "Give us the shell," the merman demanded, his voice no longer human-sounding, but a deep growl. The water around them began to churn and rise, as if responding to their anger. Ji-hoon pulled at Min-jun's sleeve. "Just give it to them," he whispered. But Min-jun stood his ground. Something told him that giving up the shell would be a terrible mistake. "This isn't just a shell, is it?" Min-jun asked, holding it up. In the moonlight it glowed with an inner light. This is something powerful. The mermaid hissed, her beautiful face twisting into something terrifying. You know nothing, human. That belongs to us. It is our heartstone, and with it, we can walk on land forever. Min-jun remembered the girl from the coffee shop, with her wet hair and strange way of speaking. Had she been one of them, already able to take human form? Min-jun backed away from the water's edge, pulling Ji-hoon with him. The sea creatures screamed in rage, a sound that made both men cover their ears. Then, to their horror, the mermaid and merman began to pull themselves out of the water, dragging their heavy tails across the sand. They can't follow us far from the water, Min-jun said. We need to run. But when they turned to flee, they found their path blocked by the girl from the coffee shop. She was no longer pretending to be human. Her skin glistened with scales, and her fingers ended in sharp claws. You could have made this easy, she said, moving toward them with unnatural speed. Now you will both become part of the sea. Min-jun looked at the shell in his hand, then at the angry sea creatures surrounding them. With sudden understanding, he raised the shell high and then smashed it against a rock. It shattered with a sound like breaking glass, releasing a bright light that shot up toward the moon. The sea creatures screamed even louder, their bodies seeming to melt and reform. The light from the broken shell surrounded Min-jun and Ji-hoon, protecting them as the sea creatures writhed in pain. You have freed us, said a new voice. From the light appeared an old woman in traditional Korean clothes. These creatures were not true sea people, but demons who stole the forms of my people long ago. They trapped our spirits in their heartstones to maintain their stolen shapes. She bowed to Min-jun. You have released us from centuries of imprisonment. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the demons dissolved into sea foam, and the old woman and the light faded away. Min-jun and Ji-hoon stood alone on the beach, watching as the tide went out, taking with it all traces of the night's strange events.